She wrote that church school work, quote, is fully as essential as the work for older pupils. The great teacher gave direction to Israel that every youth should be taught some line of useful employment. Therefore, it was the custom of the Jews, the wealthy as well as the poorer classes, to teach their sons and daughters some useful trade. Well, practical work, she wrote, helps to develop common sense. It says practical work encourages close observation and independent thought. Rightly performed, it tends to develop that practical wisdom, which we call common sense. Common sense is the ability to think practically, to apply learning. And it's not so common anymore, is it? Living Fountains or Broken Cisterns. That was the name of a book Ed Sutherland wrote when he was president of Battle Creek College. And it was the history of education from the Garden of Eden to the present, his time, contrasting false education with true education. It's a fascinating book. And that book had a big impact on my life many years ago when I read it. But before we go there, I would like to say something about our church school. You know, I'm very appreciative of Savannah as our teacher, and I think it's amazing that she took those kids out canvassing, and she had them praying before they went for a divine appointment, and they had a divine appointment with a whole work crew, and she didn't say who led that prayer, but it was one of the kids. And it was just a neat story. And each group sold a couple books, so they had some success at that too. But how many schools can you send a child to and they will teach you about divine appointments? See, that's one of the key things of what Christian education is all about. How to know God's leading. I'm very thankful we have a church school here. And a homeschool co-op and a high school co-op. This church seems to believe in Christian education. So this raises a question in my mind because I never had anybody ever tell me this, but how did the Seventh-day Adventist elementary school system come about? Do you think it just grew a little bit at a time? Or was there a movement with a notable velocity that launched it? Now, I shared several weeks ago about the first Adventist school, church school. It was in Bucksbridge, New York in 1854, but it didn't last very long. It wasn't a permanent school. And then 4 or 5 years later, a church school was started at Battle Creek that only lasted a year. And then during the Civil War, there was another short-lived school. But here's the honest-to-goodness truth. Hardly any efforts were made to establish elementary schools for over the next 45 years. In fact, there were more colleges than there were elementary schools. So when Ed Sutherland came to be president at Battle Creek College in 1897, he and his wife Sally discussed the lack of elementary schools. They concluded that the early pioneers were so focused on the spread of the three angels' messages everywhere that they kind of overlooked the importance of training their own children in the faith they held so dear. They probably just assumed, we'll just take care of it however we can as a family, and to some extent, they could. But about that time that Sutherland, Ed and his wife were thinking that some change needs to come, a message came from Ellen White, who was still in Australia. She wrote that church school work, quote, is fully as essential as the work for older pupils. In other words, secondary students, college students. And then she wrote, in localities where there is a church school should be established if there is no more than 6 children to attend. Actually, she had been calling attention to this need, which had, in her words, long been neglected. I guess there's just too much to do, and this didn't get done. But Ed Sutherland saw it even more clearly now, and he and his wife concluded there must be church schools. Now, interesting thing, coincidence or providence, Ed realized that very school year starting had a higher number of students than usual who were enrolled at Battle Creek College for the normal training. You know what normal training is? Back in that day, that's what they called teacher training. And I've always been thankful they viewed it as normal since I became a teacher. But it was teacher training. And he didn't believe it was coincidental. He believed it was providential when Ellen White was making this call and he and Sally were having these discussions. The problem is that graduation was a few years away for all these newly entering students, and churches were beginning to ask for church school teachers right away. At least 3 churches were asking if a teacher could be sent immediately. So Sutherland made an appeal for any student. He did it at the student chapel. He made an appeal for any student that felt moved by the Holy Spirit to break off his or her education to answer the call to go start schools. No one responded. Probably it was a little too sudden, unexpected. Well, he appealed the next day, and a girl got up and agreed that she would go start a school at one of these churches. And within a couple of minutes of her commitment, 2 other students stood up, and those 3 students left the college and went out to start schools and be teachers. And within 2 months, 13 students ventured out and started 13 new elementary schools in several different states. During the next school year, 57 new church schools opened, and by the fall of 1900, there were 150 more. So in just a very short time, over 200 elementary schools were opened. Nearly all the schools were started by Battle Creek College students who hadn't graduated yet and were now in the workforce and probably never would graduate. Now, I can say this. The very best teacher I had in elementary school, she was a master teacher. When I had her, she had been teaching, I think, for over 20 years. And she hadn't graduated from college yet. But she could have taught better than those college professors could have how it's done. In fact, she was so good that every year the public school asked permission to put one of their most misbehaved students in her classroom. She would accept 1 year. And I still remember the kid that was there my year. She had him wrapped around her finger in a week. I mean, this lady knew how to use the look. She knew how to use praise. She was a master. And this kid was good as gold all year. And that's what happened with all those unruly kids from public school every year. She had a reputation as a master, genius teacher. Didn't even graduate from college. Well, President Sutherland was the chief promoter of these schools all getting started. And he is regarded by those who know education history in the Adventist Church as the father of the Seventh-day Adventist school system. It was launched by his appeals and students responding. In 1899, at the General Conference session, he was asked to speak on education. And here's a quote from partway in his speech. It says, "We call our older brethren out of Babylon, but we let our children attend Egyptian schools and learn Egyptian ways." Because a lot of them were going to public schools. Now, at this point, keep in mind, conferences didn't yet have departments of education. There was no such thing as a church school superintendent in an Adventist conference. It all started without the church organization. It just started without them. They were lagging behind. In 1901, though, the General Conference urged that conferences hire superintendents and have educational departments organized. I just wonder where they got their superintendents. Probably some of those students that weren't graduated from school that already taught 2 years were ahead of everyone else got to be the superintendent. Well, Ellen White endorsed all this with her whole heart. Kind of like, it's about time. Praise the Lord. In 1902, the General Conference organized the Department of Education. And Sutherland headed up the Central Training School at the same time as he was the Battle Creek College president. And he, along with Bessie DeGraw, began producing denominational elementary textbooks. All right, so there's Bessie on the left and his wife Sally on the right. Apparently, Bessie had some skills, editing skills and writing skills. And the truth of the matter is, Sutherland and Bessie DeGraw had already started writing textbooks 2 years before. He organized a book committee among the staff at Battle Creek. But now that responsibility came under the General Conference Department of Education. But Sutherland was still the one kind of heading it up. Sutherland and Bessie provided the first reading book series ever produced in the Adventist Church. The first set of mathematics textbooks. And what's really interesting, and I wish I had time to read what, when Madison wrote textbooks, his word problems were about miles from one mission field to another, how to calculate tithe, and all kinds of word problems with numbers with spreading the three angels' messages. So he was teaching geography, he was teaching religion through mathematics word problems. This guy really had a amazing desire to make everything applicable and to, trying to think of what the word is, combine subjects into one, to integrate faith and learning. So meanwhile, Percy McGann, the dean of Battle Creek College and best friend of Ed Sutherland, he kept reminding Ed that Ellen White had urged for years for Battle Creek College to be moved into the country. Sutherland told his friend that it wasn't yet possible. However, so many young people wanted to come to Battle Creek College and had no way to pay. How do you pay for college education if you don't have the money, right? So Sutherland began to realize that they had to move to get more land where they could have a school farm and school industries which could employ students so they could pay their way through school. At least that's what Ellen White had been saying all along. So Sutherland and McGann began taking long bicycle rides out into the country, top secret bicycle rides. They were looking for the right place, and they rode for miles. Now, by this time, Ellen White had returned from Australia, and she attended the 1901 General Conference session. And when she had her opportunity to speak, she chose to speak on the fundamentals of Christian education, and she asked why the college was still in Battle Creek. And she urged them to establish the college on a large farm so that it could be developed along right lines. The General Conference delegates came under conviction and voted to authorize the Battle Creek College Board to move the institution. Well, to Sutherland and McGann, this was providential. They felt like God had taken matters into his own hands, and now was the time. The College Board put both of them in charge of the move and selected a committee that would choose and purchase suitable land. So Ed and Sally, the two of them, put a lot of miles on their bicycles looking for a suitable location. In fact, at one time, Sally went all the way over to St. Joseph's, Michigan, where the St. Joseph's River is, and she somehow got allowed to get on a freight train that would be going up through the river valley, and she was looking for land. And she did that on her own, by herself, because, Ed was too busy being president. He couldn't go as easily as she could. Well, finally, some of the committee members on bicycles, along with Ed and Percy, found the ideal situation along the St. Joseph's River, 90 miles west of Battle Creek. I wonder, they were on bicycles. These people took bike riding seriously. There was a large fruit orchard, and there was plenty of land, and there was woods. The committee felt like it was providential. And Sutherland described it all to Ellen White in a letter. She responded with great enthusiasm. She wrote back and said, "This place in Bering Springs can support a school that can be made an object lesson and I hope no one will interpose to prevent that. They named it Emmanuel Missionary College. Emmanuel meaning God is with us to train missionaries. Now think about the monumental task of trying to move a college. All the equipment, all the books, providing housing for faculty and students in suitable classrooms where currently none exist. Percy McGann had 16 railroad freight cars loaded with school stuff, furniture, and all kinds of things. And they had it delivered in an abandoned courthouse and jail that happened to be on the property. In fact, that courthouse and jail were the first classrooms and dormitories. I imagine there were a few jokes about that over those first couple of years. Many people also found places to live in the village because there wasn't enough room there. That first year, an experienced builder, he was a builder who became a Seventh-day Adventist minister. They asked him if he would come teach the students and lead them in building cottages and an assembly hall, and he came and he did it. And that assembly hall was entirely paid for by Percy McGann's wife. She had received an inheritance when her father passed away, and it was large enough to pay for the entire building of the assembly hall, and she gave it all. As Ida McGann. Now, I'm looking at the positive, but it wasn't all positive because it was hard for some students to leave nice buildings in Battle Creek to become part of a more roughing it situation on a new and very undeveloped campus. So enrollment naturally dropped. Ellen White had told them it would and not to let it discourage them. But many folks in Battle Creek opposed the move. It actually hurt some people's private businesses, and many did not like the upheaval of the status quo. They didn't want change. Opposition was strong. Faculty were divided. The move was very inconvenient. The lower enrollment and the financial challenges were said by some to be due to Sutherland and McGann being young and inexperienced. But Sutherland had already been a successful president of 2 colleges. Facts didn't matter. Some on the college board, in fact, it was a majority, were urging that Sutherland be replaced only a month after they made the move. And they would have done it. But Ellen White intervened, rebuked the critics, and actually said that God did not want these young men replaced. Meanwhile, teachers and students worked together to farm and to build. Every faculty member taught half a day and worked side by side with students half a day. Things were progressing steadily in the right direction. Avondale College in Australia set the example, and Berrien Springs followed. Now, let's give you a little bit larger context here. 1901 is when they moved to Berrien Springs. The years 1901 to 1904 were years of turmoil in Battle Creek. They had the General Conference sessions in 1901 and 1903 where there was a lot of contention. And Sutherland and McGann were not free of some of the tensions, even though they were 90 miles away. In spite of big accomplishments at Emmanuel Missionary College, mostly criticism came from Battle Creek, and much of it from the leading brethren. Fires burned the Battle Creek Sanitarium down in 1902 and the Review and Herald building the same year. And there was a rift developing between John Harvey Kellogg, A.T. Jones, kind of on one side, versus A.G. Daniels, who was leading the General Conference along with W.W. Prescott on the other side. And Sutherland and McGann were seen as Kellogg and Jones supporters, which didn't help things with the guy who was running the General Conference. And they were kind of Kellogg and Jones supporters because Kellogg and Jones had supported them better than almost anybody else. But if you know any of the history, you know that Kellogg and Jones were starting to go the wrong way. So meanwhile, at Emmanuel Missionary College, a manual arts building had been built and students were learning trades. A domestic arts building and faculty homes were also built. And I have a picture of the old administration building. I'm not quite sure what year that was built, probably within the first few years, but not right away. But instead of appreciation for accomplishments, criticism grew stronger. Why? What didn't people like? And didn't they even care that Ellen White was supporting Sutherland McGann? Well, one of the criticisms was teachers working, teachers doing manual labor. That emphasis on manual labor didn't seem like a college environment. It was too common, not elitist enough. Yet that was what the council was from the pen of inspiration. Councils, Parents, Teachers, Students 307. Useful manual labor is a part of the gospel plan. The great teacher gave direction to Israel that every youth should be taught some line of useful employment. Therefore, it was the custom of the Jews, the wealthy as well as the poorer classes, to teach their sons and daughters some useful trade. How is Adventist education done on that? If we're honest, it almost doesn't exist. Students should learn a specific trade, but every student should learn agriculture. So here's another one from Council, Parents, Teaching, Students. The next page. The students should be taught how to plant, how to gather the harvest, how to build, how to become acceptable missionary workers in practical lines. Notice that learning to do practical things was in order to be more successful in the mission field. Now, think about this for a minute. Well, I'll just tell you what follows this quote. She says, people that can have practical skills can break down prejudice easier than the people that can only talk. Because if you can fix things, you can build things, you win the respect of the people wherever you go. But if all you can do is talk, they'll say, well, why should we listen to you? But when you can do things, it changes their attitude. And this is one of the reasons this is so important. In fact, I said it this morning, so I'll say it now. I had a friend who was, he was brilliant academically, but he was also gifted with his hands. And he was great with auto mechanics. He was great with almost anything. And he went to an African country to teach mathematics in a college. When he got there, he realized that a couple of buildings had been wired by somebody who didn't know what they were doing, and they were dangerous. And there were a lot of buildings that weren't wired. He wired the entire campus and brought electricity to that entire campus. And he was the math teacher. Why did he do it? No one else there knew how. He had the balanced education that met the need. Well, some people viewed work as degrading. Like it's a result of sin. It's not very noble. Ellen's words said otherwise. In fact, referring to Adam and Eve before sin even came into the world, she says that work was good for their development physically, mentally, and spiritually in characters. As useful occupation was appointed to them, Adam and Eve, as a blessing to strengthen the body, to expand the mind and develop the character. Well, we can see how it would strengthen the body because they're working. But how does work expand the mind? How does work develop the character? Well, practical work, she wrote, helps to develop common sense. It says practical work encourages close observation and independent thought. Rightly performed, it tends to develop that practical wisdom, which we call common sense. Common sense is the ability to think practically, to apply learning. And it's not so common anymore, is it? There's a desperate need for more common sense today. Labor is still a source of happiness and development and a safeguard against temptation. Its discipline places a check on self-indulgence and promotes industry, purity, and firmness. Thus, it becomes part of God's great plan for our recovery from the fall. Think about that. Isn't industry, purity, and firmness, aren't those character traits? And it puts a check on self-indulgence and a safeguard against temptation. Do you see how she's explaining how it helps in developing character? Well, she says more there because she also is saying that it's part of God's great plan for our recovery from the fall. In other words, work has a role in the plan of redemption. Some folks in Battle Creek had been very upset that Sutherland and McGann had plowed up their ball field in order to plant crops and gardens. And they weren't forgetting it. It was still a sore spot. And they still thought that sports was the best way to get exercise. And, sports does definitely get you exercise. And I got most of my exercise growing up in sports. And sometimes I don't like doing things by myself. I like to do things in a group. So it kind of leads to, getting involved in sports. So I totally understand why a lot of people would prefer sports to get their exercise. And they all thought it was the best way. And then she says in Education 210, exercise in a gymnasium, however well conducted, cannot supply the place of recreation in the open air. For this, our schools should afford better opportunity. And then, of course, she agrees how important vigorous exercise, the pupils must have. Now, Ellen White wasn't against children tossing a ball around. She didn't think balls were sinful. In Adventist Home, page 499, she says so. But then she follows that with a concern. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, okay, I'm supposed to read this one first. All right, she says, so far as possible, facilities for manual training should be connected with every school. To a great degree, such training would supply the place of the gymnasium because they're getting exercise, and with the additional benefit of affording valuable discipline. All right, now we'll go to the Adventist Home. She says, I do not condemn the simple exercise of playing ball. And I wonder, what does she mean by playing ball? She says, but this, even in its simplicity, may be overdone. What is she worried about? She says, because when people get over interested in it, overexcited about it, she says it leads to an outlay of means that should be extended to bringing light of truth to the souls that are perishing out of Christ. She says, when people get into it, they want to spend money on all the equipment and the facilities. And she says that should be for the mission. And continuing that same quote, she says, the amusements and expenditures of means for self-pleasing, which lead on step by step to self-glorifying, and the educating in these games for pleasure, produce a love and passion for such things that is not favorable to the perfection of Christian education. Think about that. Self-pleasing, self-glorifying, a love and passion for things that don't help build Christian character. What did she mean by the simple exercise of playing ball? Did she mean competitive sports? Not likely. After calling football and boxing schools of brutality, demoralizing to the character, she comments on other sports. She says other athletic games, though not so brutalizing, stimulate the love of pleasure and excitement, thus fostering a distaste for useful labor and a disposition to shun practical duties and responsibilities. Referring to activities at an Avondale school picnic that Ellen White wrote had been shown to her in vision, she says, a view of things was presented before me in which the students were playing games of tennis and cricket. Then I was given instructions regarding the character of these amusements. They were presented to me as a species of idolatry. So that's not what she meant by a little game of ball. Well, admittedly, that was the Council of Parents, Teachers, Students 350. Admittedly, as a person who grew up playing and loving sports, I was very, very competitive. A lot of the sibling rivalry in my family was triggered by sports. These statements are very challenging to me. In fact, I remember the first time I saw them. I did not like them at all. I even went to one of my teachers, and the teacher assured me they're all out of context. They weren't. When I look back on my life, I know that in spite of getting good exercise and learning the value of teamwork, that they were detrimental. There was a detrimental effect on my disposition and character. Trying to outdo one's opponent, trying to be better than the other guy, trying to be great, none of that fits with Jesus' words in Matthew 20, 26 to 28. I'd like you to open your Bibles to Matthew 20. We're looking at principles of basic Christianity here. Matthew chapter 20. And the context of these verses we're going to read are James and John and their mom had gone to Jesus and she was asking if James and John could be on the right hand and the left hand of Jesus when he comes into his kingdom. You remember the disciples are always trying to be the greatest. And when the other disciples heard that James and John were trying to get the jump on them, they were mad. And Jesus called them and said, "Did you know the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them?" He goes, the Gentile way is to lord it over people, to try to be great. But verse 26 says, "Yet it shall not be so among you, but whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." Do you see the contrast? Now let's go to Philippians, because Paul says what it means to be like Jesus in this way. Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2, verse 3 says, "Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit." King James says through strife or vainglory. "But in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than themselves." And verse 5 says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus." These verses are not compatible with rivalry that is found in sports. And I can tell you, when I was an elementary school teacher, I learned that I could not have Bible class after PE or recess, because kids would come in all wound up for the competition of the game. If somebody dropped the ball, everybody is mad at them. "You dummy, you dropped the ball, that's why we lost," and this kind of stuff. Or, yeah, we beat you guys, And then you try to sit down and talk about the call of Christ, to die to self, to die to sin. Esteem others better than yourself. Don't try to be great over somebody, be their servants. It just is incompatible. So I learned I had to do Bible early in the morning when the kids were subdued, maybe not fully awake. No, they were awake, but they're not as fired up yet. And Bible class would go better. But it didn't work after being outside playing a competitive game. And so I learned these things gradually. But sports tends to bring out the very opposite character of the principles of self-surrender. And this fits the devil's purpose. Review and Herald, September 10, 1901. "Satan has devised a multitude of ways in which to keep men from serving God. He has invented sports and games into which men enter with such intensity that one would suppose that a crown of life was to reward the winner. And that's how hard I played." Now, I don't bring out the Spirit Prophecy statement in these Bible verses to take away anybody's joy. I know that some people probably feel that way. That's the way I felt the first time I saw them. It's just that joy is actually found elsewhere if we will believe what God tells us. Our natural human tendency is to just go with the flow, to do what everyone else does, or to just say, this is how things are done in this world, including in education. Testimonies of the Church, Volume 6, page 150 says, "It is so easy to drift into worldly plans, methods, and customs, and have no more thought of the time in which we live, and what's in the ellipse says, than did the antediluvians at Noah's time. There is constant danger that our educators, so it's talking about schools, will travel over the same ground as did the Jews, conforming to customs, practices, and traditions which God has not given. Obviously, that applies to a lot more than what we've been talking about, but what we've been talking about, it does apply. You see, we can't just do what we've always done or what we innocently did in the past. Things are progressing toward the final shaking and the end of the world, and we need to come up higher. We need the plan to be in the 144,000. So how did things turn out for Sutherland and McGann in the light of the severe criticism that they continually received? Percy's wife, Ida McGann, couldn't cope with it, and she became very ill. By 1904, it was clear she wouldn't likely recover. In fact, she passed away on the second day of the Lake Union Conference session. Sutherland and McGann had already been thinking of resigning their posts at Emmanuel Missionary College. They'd been at it for almost 4 years. And they were thinking, if the unjust criticism doesn't show any sign of abating with this Lake Union Conference session coming up, maybe it's time for us to just turn in our resignation. But the criticisms weren't abating. If anything, they were worse, in spite of Percy losing his wife. Well, they resigned, and just hours later, Ellen White publicly defended them, saying that they had done as God led and they should have been more appreciated. And she asked who would be responsible in the day of judgment for putting out the light of that mind that should be shining today. She says, now the poor woman is gone, leaving 2 motherless children. All this because of the work done by unsanctified tongues. Now, she didn't claim Sutherland and McGann were perfect in everything. She even wrote to them and said that sometimes you react too strongly to A.G. Daniels and W.W. Prescott. And, so she tried to advise them to be more patient, but she did not criticize them for resigning. And only a month or so later, Sutherland and McGann were down near Nashville, Tennessee. And guess who went there to meet up with them? Ellen White. See, these 2 men felt that God's work in the South was quite neglected, and they wanted to start a small school in a remote area and forget the church leaders. It would be their own school where church leaders couldn't interfere as had happened so much to them in Bering Springs, Michigan. Ellen White met up with them there because she believed God had bigger plans for them. She told them about a large farm along the Cumberland River that they should purchase, or at least go look and see. Well, they went to see it, and they thought it was one of the worst plots of land they'd ever set eyes upon. It was full of deep gulches, barren hillsides, worn-out soil, plenty of farmland, but worn out, and lots of rocks. And did I say lots of rocks? Lots of rocks. They didn't want the place. It was way too large. They wanted to keep it small and manageable so they could have peace. It was way too large. And because of being too large, it also was going to cost too much. And they could see that it would take too much work to turn it into a profitable farm. But the spirit of prophecy said it was favorable for what they wanted to do. And they needed a large place because God had a large work for them. They actually literally sat on a pile of rocks and wept. They had always advocated following the Lord's counsel. But this seems so wrong. And of course, verses like this came to their mind. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not into your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and depart from evil. Verses like this help them move forward. And verses like this too. For the wisdom of the world is foolishness with God. As hard as it was and as wrong as it felt, they trusted that God was leading, and they arranged to purchase the land. Now, I'm going to jump ahead in time just to show you what they did with those rocks. They built an administration building from all those extra rocks, all free material. Now, it was a while before they had that. But here's an interesting thing. Ellen White was so interested in this school succeeding, and she believed these two men had the best understanding of Christian education in the whole Seventh-day Adventist denomination. And so she decided to accept their request to be on the board of trustees of Madison College. It was the only Adventist school she ever accepted to be on the board. Sutherland and McGann named their school Nashville Agricultural Normal Institute. The word normal, as I said before, refers to teacher training in those days. And later it became known as Madison College because it was in Madison, Tennessee. Now, Ellen White called for more schools to be established, quote, on the Madison order in various parts of the South. She said that if there were more schools giving similar training, quote, we as a people would become a spectacle to the world, to angels and to men. The message would be carried to every country, and souls now in darkness we brought to the light. That's from Spalding McGann, Unpublished Testimonies, page 423. Now, isn't it interesting that somehow having correct education was supposed to finish the gospel going to the world? I'm not sure I understand it, but that's an amazing thing to say, that it would become a spectacle to the world, to angels and men, and it would help carry the truth, the message to all the world. Now, I'll just give you a little insight into what Madison was like. I'm still studying this out, trying to figure out everything that they did. But Sutherland established over 20 businesses at Madison. The college ran, I think, 22 businesses. And students and teachers both worked in them side by side. Students could come to Madison with no money, and by graduation day, they left with no debt, cash in hand or in the bank. You ever heard of any school ever doing that? I think Madison's the only one in history. The students would know how to run more than one business, how to keep books, and many went out to start similar schools. In fact, by 1909, only 5 years later, 13 rural schools were educating more than 500 children. And over time, later years, there were 40 satellite schools established by Madison College in the South. And some of them are still doing well today. Anyone here ever heard of Heritage Academy? How about Little Creek? Little Creek became Heritage Academy. Anyone here ever heard of Laurel Brook Academy? Fletcher Academy, Madison Academy, Harbor Hills Academy. You know the guy who's from Harbor Hills, Steve Dixon, I think his name, because he's in mission work. So not all those schools have existed after all these years, but some of them are still there doing well. In later years, Madison was featured in Reader's Digest. This was in the 1930s. They were intrigued with the idea that a school could be self-supporting. How could a school be self-supporting? You know, Harvard and Stanford were started by wealthy people who basically bankrolled those schools. And every college and university in the land has their list of wealthy benefactors to keep them going. How in the world does a school pay for itself? Well, one is teachers work so they're productive. They actually earn their salary by production, not just by teaching. That was one of the things that was interesting about Madison. So the Reader's Digest article explained the principles of education by which it operated, and whoever wrote the article was pretty persuasive to the readers because it resulted in over 5,000 new applications all at once and over 20,000 letters of inquiry. Many newspapers ran feature articles on Madison, including the New York Times. And Nellie Drolyard, I'll just tell you something about her real quick. She along with Bessie DeGraw and Percy and Ed and Ed's wife Sally, they all went to Madison. But who was Nellie Drilliard? Nellie Drilliard and her husband had been missionaries in Africa, and they returned right around the time of the move to Bering Springs. And she joined the faculty at Emmanuel Missionary College and became the treasurer of the institute. She was really good with money, good with records, and she had wealth connections. And so she was a benefactor. And then she decided to go with Ed and Sally and Percy and Bessie to Madison. So she had a lot to do with helping things get going there financially. And she was kind of a financial genius and really helped them a great deal. There's a sign there. We're at the site of Madison College. It says Madison College was founded in 1904 as Nashville Agricultural Normal Institute by Seventh-day Adventists on a farm of 412 acres. A sanitarium and campus industries were integral to the plan of work and study for students, training for careers in agriculture, teaching, religion, industrial arts, nursing, and allied health courses and other fields. Now, it's interesting that this sign mentions it was a sanitarium. How did a sanitarium come about? Because Ed Sutherland and Percy McGann were not doctors, although Percy's second wife was, and so she gave them some guidance. But you know what Ed and Percy did? After Madison got more stabilized, they started going every day down to Nashville to a medical school, and they got their doctorate degrees. Can you imagine these guys, what all they've done? Now they're doctors. And so nurses training obviously became a very important part of Madison College. And here's a picture of a whole bunch of nurses out in front of a building. It's probably 1930s also, having their picture taken. And how many of you know that there's a connection between Percy McGann and Loma Linda? How many of you know that? All right, a few of you do. How many of you know that the College of Medical Evangelists was going to shut down one year for financial reasons, and Madison College gave them a financial gift to keep them going? Did you know that? Madison College bailed out the College of Medical Evangelists to keep it going. And then later, they wanted someone who really understood how Madison worked, that also understood medicine. And so they peeled Percy McGann off of Madison College and Ed Sutherland's right-hand man. And Percy McGann spent many years in leadership at the College of Medical Evangelists here in Loma Linda. Well, you probably are aware that Madison College no longer exists today, but the Madison Academy is still there. There's a large Adventist church, the Madison Church, and the Kentucky-Tennessee Conference. And there's a hospital there where the sanitarium became a hospital. That's what's left. So the question is, what are the lessons we can learn from the history of our educational efforts as Seventh-day Adventist people? You know, before Madison became famous in the world through Reader's Digest and New York Times and newspapers, long before it reached its golden age, Ellen White made a statement that's in a manuscript release, Volume 8, 202 to 203. And I only found this last night, so I couldn't put it on a slide. Didn't have time, and I had to at least get some sleep. All right, so this is what it says. The work that the laborers have accomplished at Madison has done more to give a correct knowledge of what an all-around education means than any other school that has been established by Seventh-day Adventists in America. The Lord has given these teachers in the South an education that is of the highest value, and it is a training that God will be pleased to have all our youth receive. She gave it the highest endorsement over every other school. So the question is, what can we learn from all that? Is that all just history, or the principles still mean something today? Our closing song is 570, Not I, But Christ.